Hello again. This is Jason Thompson with the Jasonisms. Thanks for joining me. What we're going to talk about this week, data. Diversity data is really important. And one of the things I find is there are a couple different ways to get data, right? There's that numeric data, who's in the organization, and there's survey data. We're going to talk about both. Because what I find is that if you don't know how to manage those two things, you're going to find yourself in trouble. But number one, you have to start with data. That's a Jason. Start with data. Why? Because if you don't know where you started, you don't know how you change anything. And it's a miss. A lot of times what happens is people start with, we got to start with our diversity plan. And I'm not against the plan, but what are you putting in the plan if you don't know where you started from? Like people get that ahead of themselves. Like if you have a diversity plan at all, the plan should be what data do we have and how do we manage it? That should be where you start because you need to know. It could be that the organization is reasonably diverse. Nobody stays. We have high turnover. So by collecting the data, I know the difference, right? The second piece is I don't do surveys. This is kind of controversial in some ways. And the reason I don't is because generally what I find is they're based on majority rule. So I always tell people, if you're going to do a survey and you want to do a survey around diversity, the question you have to ask yourself is, are you going to change the entire organization based on one survey? People would laugh at this and say, no, we don't, right? Because essentially what happens is it's majority rule. So, and I have this happen all the time. I'm the only person of color in my team. We do the survey and I write, this place is terrible, treats me terrible, it's completely racist, right? We can't use the data because it's not anonymous anymore. You know it was me. Right. So the data is not really usable. Well, the second thing you do is you go, well, let me combine it with the other department. Well, I have a different manager than the person in the other department. The only thing we share is that we might both be people of color. So that's inherently biased and racist too. But anyway, so that's what they do. And that's the solution. But if I was one of 10, my vote at one point was 10%. You've now combined me with another department. I'm one of 20. So what that means that my vote is worth 5%. Because the assumption would have to be that the other Black person in the other department is also having a terrible experience. So if they're not, we basically negate each other out. So therefore, most organizations never change over one survey. I have actually tested this a couple of times myself when these surveys, again, I'll write something in that just blatantly says, this has been blatantly racist towards me. It never makes it. And the reason it does is because you know who said it. So they can't share it. So I've tested it. You can test yourself. Like you can write things like that in there. And generally those types of comments will be removed because people will assume it's you. And so to protect your anonymous, they just basically remove that. So that is the weakness of surveys. But the question then it comes on the data. Well, what data would I use? I'd be look at your annual reviews. Are people of color, are their reviews as similar as their peers? Women, are their reviews as similar as their peers? Look at who gets promotion. Look at terminations. Right? These are all things that are good data points that are going to give you good information. And it's not to say that, no survey is any good and you can never use a survey, but a survey has to be put into the context of how it's applied. And they're basically interpreted based on the majority rule. So if the majority of people are having a great time and you're the only person of color and you're having a terrible time, they're not going to change it for you. Generally, that's just not going to happen. And this kind of goes back to some of my other principles, right? Of unrealistic expectations, because what happens too, and this is the hardest thing too about being a diversity officer, is people love these surveys. They send them out and we're going to get information about how people are being treated. And again, you have the situation where you have one person in a department who happens to be a woman. They say it's terrible and you can't do anything about it because you took that survey to the manager. They didn't know exactly who it was. Well, conversely, that employee also comes to me and goes, well, every year I write in that he's treating me terrible. Why don't you do anything? And it's like, well, I can't use the survey because it's supposed to be anonymous. So you can see how this circular argument is inherently biased based on majority rule. And then in some cases, even if we were able to use it, the pushback would be, well, that's only 5% of all the surveys said this. 95% of the people happy. Like by definition, you start diminishing that whatever that comment is. So it becomes literally unusable because the managers are going to defend themselves by saying, well, this is one survey. 95% approval, no big deal. This is normal, right? So it makes it really difficult to use survey data and comments because a lot of times it's not really actionable. But I think there are still good data points. You have to start with data like, what did you look like the day you started and launched your diversity program? What's it look like longitudinal? Who's getting promoted? Who's getting terminated? How long do people stay? Those are all good data points. Look at annual reviews. How are people being rated? And that's an important one because one of the things we find that's kind of hidden in the data is that in theory, women are getting promoted. But when you look at their annual review scores, it's just always slightly lower. And because it's always slightly lower, they get less of a raise. And because they always get less of a raise, even though it seems slight, over 20 or 30 years, that works out to $40,000 or $50,000. We did some math around this. So that's why it's so important to understand your data and look at it in a lot of different places, because that's one of the subtle places that I would suggest and argue the reason we have a pay gap and continue to see this pay gap isn't because we haven't fixed how people start the organization. It's the annual reviews and how we apply that information in order to give people raises. And even though I might get a good rating, my male peer gets a slightly better rating, and that 1%, even though it seems very insignificant, all of a sudden over time starts to create this pay gap. So I guess the other question this brings us to, right, is are there some contexts in which a survey would be helpful? And the short answer is yeah. Sometimes it's because there's a disconnect, or sometimes it's, everyone says, I'm having a great time here, but we still see women are turning over at a high rate. There's a disconnect between that survey. So the survey information, and that's a data point that tells us something that we should probably look at. These things when they're inconsistent means people have learned I'm supposed to say something, but they don't stay. So it can still be a data point that drives other information. So I would never say never use a survey, but when you see those kind of inconsistencies where people say, oh, I'm having a great time here, but they still leave at a high rate, it means that they've just learned to say the right thing. And then it is a clue. Like, for instance, if you do have a lot of people or a couple people who say something is negative, it's worth looking into, even if it's one survey. Like, to me, that's the commitment an organization has to make, is one survey actually has to be enough, because it's a clue to how people are being treated within the department.